Gospels, of course, are well known, and the thing about the Gospels is that there's four. And often we wonder and we ponder about, well, why the need for four Gospels? Well, I did some research and I've been looking in the Gospels, and Mark took my interest, and I came to find that Mark, his Gospel teaches a lot about me, a lot about where I am in life. And I guess in some ways it does about you as well, because have you ever come on a Sunday morning and you've attended the memorial meeting, and of course there's 52 Sundays in the year, and I just wonder how many of those Sundays you've come along thinking that you're feeling successful, where you could say that you've had a successful week, where your discipleship has made some significant progress and that you've given 100%. You've showed a full commitment in your service. Well, if you're anything like me, brothers and sisters, you probably can count those Sundays on one hand. It's not that often, is it, that we can come with that sense of success. We often come instead feeling a little bit like a failure, of incomplete service, and all the reasons that you can think of are all there, whether through mistakes of our own making, a misunderstanding that got out of hand, a lack of compassion or appreciation of someone, or ruining misspent time or opportunities, whatever it might be. Any one of those things, and many more, could be the reason why we're not feeling successful. Well, when we come to the Gospel of Mark, brothers and sisters, we get a sense that Mark understands our feelings. If that's how you've come on Sundays, and maybe tomorrow that's how you'll come again, don't despair. Don't despair, because Mark knew about failure. Of all the gospel writers, he knew exactly how you feel. And what I discovered when I came to the Gospel of Mark is that he presents in his gospel the disciples as failures. It's remarkable. He presents them in the most unfavorable light. Not one good thing is said about the disciples anywhere in the Gospel of Mark. It's quite astonishing. And perhaps because, here in the Brotherhood and even in the wider Christian community, we take the four Gospels as a whole, don't we? And say, here's the biography of the Lord, and we put them all together and we try and harmonize them. And so, of course, we know everything because of the four Gospels. But it was never intended to be read like that. They were four individual Gospels. And if you took Mark and read Mark on its own, you'll see the disciples floundering on every level. For example, there's no mention of Peter walking on water. There's no commendation to Peter, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah." There's no giving to Peter the keys of the kingdom. There's no comments like, "Then understood the disciples that he spake of John the Baptist." There's no preaching effort by the 12, where they were given power and authority to heal and cure the sick of their diseases. There's no record of John coming up close to the cross and then taking Mary under his care to look after her. There's no Peter saying, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee." None of that in the Gospel of Mark. If all you read and all you had was the Gospel of Mark, you'd think that the disciples were nothing but failures. And that's really Mark's point. That when it comes to service, because that's our title, Mark, the Gospel of Service. I hope that we'll show that this afternoon. When it comes to service and commitment and work and purpose, all of us are failures, aren't we, brothers and sisters, when placed next to the Lord? And so there's the disciples placed next to the Lord, and they are failures in all of those areas of service and work and commitment. So this afternoon, I just want to share a little bit with you about Mark's gospel, and particularly take the theme of the disciples as they go through Mark's gospel and the way in which they're presented to us. But before we do that, we can't really continue any further unless we have a look at Mark himself, Mark the man. What inspired him to write this gospel? Where's he coming from? Who is this individual, this man, Mark, John Mark, as we suggest that he is? Well, the very first mention of Mark in the scriptures, I believe, is in his own gospel in chapter 14. So there's a little reference here, a comment made here, where the only person that would know this detail must have been the author. Mark 14, verse 51. We all know the circumstances. There was this young man that followed Jesus into the garden. And it says, when all the other disciples in verse 50 forsook him and fled, it says in verse 51, and there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body, and the young men, the soldiers, laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Now there's no eyewitnesses to that. The disciples have already fled, haven't they? There's no one else left to tell the tale about this young man unless the young man is Mark himself. And he knows what he did on that night. He knows he fled. He fled from the Lord. He fled from the garden. Now, how old was Mark at this time? Well, we don't really know. We're just going to make a suggestion here. But he's relatively young because he's still a young man later on when we had that reading in Acts 13, when he's taken with Paul and Barnabas on the first journey. So he's relatively young there. So I'm going to suggest that he's a young teenager here, perhaps even as young as 13, maybe 15, somewhere around there, a very young lad who, when Judas and the disciples, or the soldiers, I should say, when the soldiers knocked on his mother's front door, we believe it was the Mary's house, that was the upper room, and that's his mother, so it's his house. And they came and knocked on the door looking for Jesus with Judas leading them. Okay, and they don't find him there. And Judas says, well, I think I know where he'll probably be. He's probably up in bed because what he's got wrapped around him is a linen cloth, like a bed sheet, big bed sheet that's wrapped around him. And he hears this and he jumps out, maybe the window, or races through the back door, and he goes off to warn Jesus, doesn't he? And the disciples, that the soldiers are coming, and he gets there too late. And when the soldiers go to grab him, he flees as well. So he's a very young lad. Well, the next mention of Mark is in the Acts of the Apostles. So chapter 12, the chapter just before our reading, in Acts chapter 12, we're told that he's the son of Mary. No mention of his dad, so we presume Mark's father is no longer on the scene. And it says, Acts 12 and verse 12, and when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. So there's our young lad, John Mark, and his mother Mary. Peter, after he had escaped from the prison with the help of the angel, came to this house. But then, at the end of chapter 12, we're told in verse 25, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. Off they go. They're going to go on a journey. And in chapter 13, we're told how the mechanics of this little group worked. In verse 5, and when they were at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had also John to their minister. That's a very interesting word. I want you to take note of that word. That becomes a key word that becomes a word associated with Mark and then with his gospel. They had John to their minister. So this word minister, the Greek word hyperites, if that's how you pronounce it, I'm not entirely sure, but it means an attendant or a servant. So Mark's gone with Paul and Barnabas to be their servant. Okay, so he's got the job of ministering and attending to their needs, carrying the bags, etc., etc. He's going to serve in this work of ministry as the gospel was being preached. But of course, we know the story, don't we? The last verse that we had read in our little reading, in verse 13, tells us that John departs halfway through. We don't know why. He departs from them, returning to Jerusalem. So verse 13, now when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. Maybe it was something to do with his mum. We know that those that were still in Jerusalem were going through some hard times. Paul was going to go around collecting money for the poor saints in Jerusalem. We don't know the story, but it's quite clear that later on, Paul considers him a deserter. That's the word and the idea that he uses. He's left the work of ministry. He's left the service. He can't be trusted. Now, how old was Mark at this stage? Well, it's quite interesting. If Paul and Barnabas' first journey was around AD 47, so if he was, say, 13 or so back in the garden, when he fled back in Mark 14, it makes him about 30 years old now, taken on this first journey. And he flees a second time. He leaves the work of service. This is the second time he's decided to flee. We'll come to chapter 15 now. The story continues 3 years later, and Paul decides it's time to go on a second journey. He wants to take Barnabas with him, we're told. But of course, Barnabas wants to take John Mark. There's a relationship between Barnabas and John Mark, their uncle and nephew. So naturally, Barnabas says, let's take John Mark. So Barnabas wants to take his nephew. Have a look at verse 37. Verse 36, and some days after, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we've preached the word of the Lord and see how they do. Great idea. It's been 3 years. Let's go and see them all again. But verse 37, and Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. I want to take John Mark with us. Oh, that caused some tension, didn't it? Have a look at verse 38. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who deserted from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. No way, says Paul. I'm not having him. He's unreliable. He deserted us on the first journey. What's to say he won't do that again? And notice that Paul gives his reason. He went not with them to the work. He wasn't a worker. He wasn't willing to work and to serve, to be an attendant, to give commitment 100%. There was always a question mark about Mark, whether he would stay with the group or leave for a second time. And it says this in verse 39, that the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder, one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed on to Cyprus. Just imagine, as a young brother, that you are the one responsible for the cause of the greatest division the brotherhood had ever seen at that time. Between two great pillars in the truth, two great personalities. You're the reason why these two brethren can no longer continue in the same work. It's you. And they departed asunder. They broke apart, all because of you. So this is 3 years later, when this second journey begins, and that makes him about 33 years old. Just imagine, at 33 years of age, what is the purpose of your life? Imagine thinking like Mark, where am I going? What's my life all about? He's 33 years old. That makes him, brothers and sisters, around about the same age as the Lord, who at 33 years old went to the cross full of purpose, knowing what his work was all about with 100% commitment, and was able at the end of it to say, it is finished. You see, Mark at the age of 30 or thereabout was the same age as Jesus beginning his ministry, and then at 33, Mark is an utter failure. He's fled from the garden. That's number one. He's fled on the first journey. That's number two. He's not even taken on the second journey. That's number three. He's an utter failure. At the same time, the Lord was the greatest success. How would you face life after that? What would go through your mind? What would you do? Well, here's the remarkable thing, brothers and sisters. Mark turns his life completely around. And it's an astonishing turnaround. In 3 occasions, the Apostle Paul makes mention of Mark and praises Mark beyond any recognition from the failure that we see here in Acts 15. It's astonishing the way in which Paul comes to depend on Mark. Have a look at these quotations. Go to the first one in Philemon, verse 24. Verse 23, there salute thee, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers. Marcus is called a fellow laborer. Now, this was written around about AD 61, 62, so that would make Mark about 44 years old or thereabouts. And at that stage, 44 years of age, Paul is calling him now a fellow laborer, along with Aristarchus, Demas, and Lucas. He's working in the truth with me. He's a fellow worker. He's a fellow laborer. That's interesting, isn't it? Come along to Colossians and chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom ye receive commandments. If he come unto you, receive him. So in this verse, Paul reveals that there is a connection between Barnabas and Mark. Now, I know it says sister's son, probably better if it was changed to cousin's son. Cousin's son, the word sister is not there. It's most likely that Barnabas was brother to Mark's dad. Now, remember, what was Barnabas? Barnabas was a Levite. And so probably Mark was a Levite also. So you get this connection. But notice what Paul says to the Colossian ecclesia. He says, touching whom ye received commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. I sent you a command. I wanted you to look out for him, take care of him. Please receive and accept him when he comes to you. And that's probably because it was in that neck of the woods that he was known as a deserter. That's where he left. He would have had that nickname. He can't stand the word. Up there in Asia Minor, he left that place. And Paul's writing to the Colossians saying, don't shut Mark out. He's a changed man. Receive him. Let him come and work with you. It's astonishing from the interaction that Paul and Barnabas had, saying, no way, he can't. He's a deserter. I don't want him. He's not going to be good for the work. Now, Paul is saying to the Colossians, you let him come You let him work. Come to 2 Timothy and chapter 4. So these are some of the last words of the Apostle Paul, aren't they? As we know, around about AD 67, perhaps, somewhere around there. So Mark's maybe around the age of 50 now. And he says this in verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. Profitable to me for the service. This word that we've seen that was used in Acts 13. He was helping Paul and Barnabas. He was their minister. And then he left the service. Now he's profitable for the service. I want you to bring him with you. Bring him to me, please. For he's profitable to me for the ministry. Our word that we've seen, a profitable servant. He's a willing servant. I want him, bring him. So here's the anomaly. The question that arises out of all of this clearly is, well, what changed Mark? What caused that change to go from a failed servant to a faithful servant? He's fled from the Lord in the garden. He's fled again from Paul on the first journey. He's rejected by Paul. You'd feel an utter failure, wouldn't you? What does life now hold for Mark? Well, it was about 10 years or so between that saying to Barnabas, no, he's not coming, to when he writes to Philemon and then later to the Colossians to say he's a man worth having. He's a hard worker. So what brought about that change? So just some suggestions on that. Because, well, we know that Barnabas took him under his wing, as Uncle Barnabas would. Uncle Barnabas's nickname was Consolation, wasn't he? He was a man of comfort and consolation. He'd put your arm around you and draw you under your wing. And so off they go and they preach in Cyprus for a while. But I'm going to suggest that another figure takes him under his wing and inspires this young man. Come to 1 Peter. A remarkable thing happens here in 1 Peter that helps Mark immensely. And if you want a picture of what mentorship is in the truth, brothers and sisters, this is what it is here in 1 Peter. This is what guidance and direction and leadership is all about. Helping others to become faithful servants, even if they had the biggest utter failure in their past. And of course, none of us, as we've said already, are successes. To claim to be a success is to be a liar, isn't it? We all need help. And here's Mark's help right here. So it's right at the end of the epistle. He's rounding off his epistle. He says in verse 13, the ecclesia that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son. Where did that come from? Peter calls Mark his son. Now, don't be fooled, brothers and sisters. This is not the word that Paul uses of Timothy, his son in the faith. Okay, that word that's used by Paul about Timothy is the Greek word teknon. And that means to be a son by behavior. My son in the faith doesn't mean a literal son. A son by character or behavior. And of course, there was this correlation between Timothy and Paul. If you looked at Timothy, you could see Paul. They were fellow laborers. He's my son in the faith because of his behavior, because of his character. This word son is different. I've got it on the screen there. This Greek word hunos, I've got an N in mind. I don't know why. Huios, it should be. It means a son by birth or by adoption. That's what this word means. It literally means to be a son by birth or by adoption. And I've got up there an example. You remember in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen gets up to give his speech, he talks through the history of Israel, starting with Abraham, and he goes through and he starts talking about Moses, and he calls him the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, that's not the word teknon. Pharaoh's daughter literally adopted Moses, didn't she? And he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Well, this is describing a really close bond. And I believe that if we were to take the meaning of this word as it stands, Peter, maybe because Mark didn't have a father anymore, there wasn't a father figure in his life and he was floundering and he needed help, that Peter adopts him as his son and gives him the biggest help that could ever be given to this man, Mark, who's floundering with no purpose, no goal. He's directionless. He feels an utter failure. And at the age of 33, he is rock bottom at the same age when Jesus was the greatest success. So here's Peter taking Mark on board and really putting his arm around him, helping him, mentoring him, guiding him, giving him purpose again, motivation and inspiration. And of course, that's exactly what we need in the brotherhood today, isn't it, brothers and sisters? We're going to see some things in Mark's gospel in our second talk that show how many mixed messages there are out there in the world. All of those mixed messages, if we try and adopt them, it's going to make us unsuccessful. And our job as mentors to our younger ones is to try and cut through all the clutter and the noise to find what's essential, to find out what life is really all about, and pass on the baton to those younger ones who are coming through, who need to have some purpose and direction. And they'll find it from your inspiration. Well, Mark finally had that. And I think, and this is speculation a little bit, but it is based on many of the church fathers who say this back in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. Much of their work's been lost, but there was a man, Eusebius, who suggests, because of his work that he wrote, that Mark got his information for his gospel from Peter. And I think that makes absolute sense. And so what we're reading in the Gospel of Mark is Peter's version of events. And of course, that all makes sense, doesn't it? Because Peter doesn't put himself forward. Peter's not in the limelight. He's not at the front, even though in Matthew's Gospel he is. Even though in Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel he is. Those Gospel writers put Peter walking on water. They say that the Lord said to Peter, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah." You'd find that in the other 3 Gospels, but in Mark's Gospel, listening to Peter, Peter never says any of that. Every other individual in Mark's Gospel is seen as a failure apart from the Lord himself. He's gone from failed servant to faithful servant. We saw how he fled from helping the Lord in the garden at around about the age of 13. We saw how he fled from serving the Lord with the Apostle Paul around about the age of 30. And then we saw how he was rejected utterly out of hand by Paul in serving the Lord again at around about the age of 33. He doesn't know what to do. And so we found that he turns his life around with some help. Barnabas, certainly in the first instance, but more so Peter. And he's guided and helped. And as a Levite, their job was to record, to write things down. That was what they were trained to do. Levites were trained to do that. They were the first recorders in the Old Testament, weren't they? And here's Mark, the Levite, recording the life of the Lord from what he heard from Peter. And he writes the gospel, a wonderful gospel of the perfect servant. His gospel is going to be all about service. Well, naturally, you would expect that from Mark's point of view. And that gospel, brothers and sisters, I'm going to suggest, came to Paul's attention. And when Paul saw that gospel, Paul was convinced that this man was totally changed and was now dependable, reliable, and needed in the work of the truth. And so only about 10 years later, he's there in the writings of the Apostle Paul being demonstrated as a mentor and an inspiration to others. And I think that's probably how Mark comes back into favor with Paul again, based on the writing of this gospel. And so I think Mark's writing this gospel probably around the year AD 53 to 55. There's obviously no way of proving any of that, but somewhere around there, I'm going to suggest that around the age of 36 to 38, Mark's sitting down to write this gospel, and it's an incredible gospel. If you got some time to just go through and unpack every aspect of this gospel, brothers and sisters, you'll find it amazing. I love this gospel. In fact, I'm going to suggest that Mark wrote his gospel first. So as we said at the beginning, there are 4 gospels, and of the 4 gospels, 3 of them are very, very similar. We call them the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means to have the same view or perspective. From 2 Greek words, sun and opus, with view. So similar view. 3 gospels are included in this idea, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you sort of think, why do you need 3 gospels that are almost similar? There's very little variations between them. It doesn't seem to make sense. They're not called the synoptic gospels for nothing. They are very similar. Some of you may have seen this chart. It's readily available on the internet, along with many others that have done this work. You'll see that there's approximately 650 verses found in the Gospel of Mark. 600 of these verses are found in either Matthew or Luke. Like, there's only 3% that's unique to Mark. 3% that's not found anywhere else. And this is why I think maybe Mark was written first. You sort of got to think, that's a bit rich. If you think Matthew wrote his gospel first or Luke wrote his gospel first, and along comes Mark, it's not that they're similar because they sat down independently. They must have seen and read the other gospels to be almost word for word in places. And along comes Mark, and he sees Matthew's gospel, and he says, well, that's pretty heavy. I'm going to shrink it down. I'm going to just reduce it down. Matthew's 28 chapters, Mark's only 16. And he just writes the same thing and shrinks it down. Gives the slimline version, but it's already been written. What would be the purpose? It seems much more likely that Mark wrote his gospel first, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a template for their own gospel. And you can actually see it. You can take Matthew's gospel and overlay it on top of Mark's gospel, and you can see where they've used Mark as a template. And they then insert their own material in the parts that they want to make their gospel unique. But they use Mark's gospel as a template because they know that Peter was behind it. And Peter was the leader of all the disciples, the apostles. And Matthew and Luke recognize that and accept that. Luke and John both tell us that there were many other gospels written at this time as well. Not just 4. Many have taken in hand. There were many gospels already in existence, says Luke. Many have decided to try and collect all this information. I'm going to tell you it from my point of view, he says. And he had a particular reason. He's writing to a man called Theophilus. John says many other things which Jesus did, if they should be written, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books. So there was enough information out there on Jesus that you could have written 4 totally different gospels. And yet 3 of them have material that is almost identical. And you sort of say, why? So just to get your minds going on the Gospel of Mark, we'll just use a couple of minutes to just show you where Mark is thinking on the record of the Lord Jesus Christ. Mark splits his gospel into two halves. It's quite readily easy to see. It splits around chapter 8, verse 27. 26, 27. There's a marked change at that point. Neatly falls into two halves. The first half is all up in the north, Galilee. All right? The second half is down in Jerusalem and Judea. Now you might think, okay, so Jesus spent all his ministry mainly up in the north and then he came down south. That's not actually how it happened. As you know from John's gospel, John talks about him going up to Galilee, then down to Jerusalem for a feast, then back up to Galilee, and then down to Jerusalem for another feast, and then back up to Galilee. He was going back and forth all the time. Mark chooses not to say that. He's splitting his gospel into two halves to show you other points, and he centers it all up there in the north to begin with, and then there's this marked change, and then he centers it on the way to Jerusalem and in Jerusalem. And between the two halves, you get a focus. He's the perfect servant, Mark's going to say. I want to show you the life of this man. I want you to see him. And so what he does is he uses a key word in the first half, and then he uses a different key word in the second half. The key word in the first half, most of you would probably be aware, maybe some of the really young ones may not be. It's this Greek word euthios, which is translated immediately, straightway, forthwith, etc., all through Mark's gospel. But predominantly the first half. In fact, 10 times in the first chapter alone. So what he does is he gets the Lord Jesus Christ working from the get-go. He's going to show the servant working right from the start. And it's going to be a mad dash to the end. All this work, he's only got 3.5 years to get this work done. So he's on the go, it's full pace. In fact, this word, it means as soon as possible. We use that ourselves. This is ASAP. Straight from page 1, Mark is showing the Lord working ASAP. All right, this is the Son of God on the move. The servant is working. But then we reach a change. And things slow down a little bit. And now the servant is heading to the cross. He has a work to do, and it involves him appearing on the cross for the benefit of mankind. And so the key word in the second half is this word paradidomi. It means to hand over, to deliver, to betray. He was handed over by the soldiers, etc., into the hands of the authorities, both Jewish and Roman, and then eventually delivered up and put on the cross for humanity to see. And so this is the Son of God on the cross where the servant must suffer. So come to chapter 10. So the two key words, okay, are brought together. The two ideas are brought together in Mark chapter 10. This is the first key word in the first half. It's found 40 times in the gospel, but 31 of them are in the first half. That's where the focus is. He hasn't stopped working in the second half, but all the fast work is happening in the first half. It shows Jesus as a hard worker. He's not stopping. He has 3.5 years to get this done, and so it's full pelt right from the start. Whereas the second half has this key word, which Thayers says, to give into the hands of another, to give over into another's power. And there's 20 times in all, but there's only 4 times it's used in the first half. So you can see how the focus changes. And so here in Mark chapter 10, verse 43, we'll finish our first half with this verse here. Chapter 10, verse 43. But so shall it not be among you, but whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister. So I hope by now you've seen that this word minister is quite important in Mark's life. It means to be a servant, an attendant. Okay? And then verse 44, and whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. Minister, servant. And here it is. I think this is the key verse in Mark's gospel. And you can sort of draw on everything we've learnt about Mark and see why this would be so important to Mark. He can see where Jesus is and what he's doing and why he did it and how come he was successful. Because Mark, who tried to do similar and follow in the life of the line of our Lord, failed. He never got there. Failed 3 times, in fact. But the Lord never failed, not once. For the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give his life a ransom for many. And I think there you capture the 2 halves of the Gospel of Mark. So to minister, to be a servant is chapter 1 to 8. And then to give his life a ransom for many, to be delivered up, to be betrayed, and to go to the cross is the second half of Mark's gospel. The idea of paying the price in freeing others from slavery. In order to free others from the servitude to sin, he first had to be a servant to righteousness. And so Mark is going to show you how and why this servant was successful. So Mark is going to show us what leadership looks like from his perspective. Leadership, from Mark's perspective, is through service. If you want to be a leader, have a look at the Lord. He led through his service, as opposed to, and maybe this is how you might try and do leadership. Some of these are good, actually. Leadership through delegation does happen. Ecclesias delegate, our leaders delegate different roles. Leadership through principle, that's good as well. Leadership through commands, that might be helpful. Or maybe we might do leadership through bribery or through bullying and intimidation. But Luke says, no, I want to show you leadership through service. And so that's what he's going to do. From Mark chapter 1 right through to chapter 16, I want you to see the Lord leading the world to success, but doing it through service. Let's leave it there, and then we'll pick up some aspects about Mark's gospel in our second study.